George Washington was born fully clothed, with his hair powdered, and upon his entrance into the world made a stately bow. That is something that Nathaniel Hawthorne once said. And I want you to think about that. We'll come back to that quote and why I think it's an important one. But what my company is called is Indispensable, and what my book is called was Indispensable: Learning How to Succeed and Lead from George Washington. And indispensable is such a powerful word. I'm certainly not the first one to say George Washington was indispensable. Historians have been saying that since, for quite a long time. And so you think about that and you think, what does the word indispensable mean? Who is indispensable to you? Because if you look the word up in the dictionary, what it means is absolutely necessary. And very few of us really are absolutely necessary. And you think in your life, who has been absolutely necessary? Well, your mother was. I can guarantee you that, or you would not have been here. She was absolutely necessary, but who else? And the people in your life that you think of as absolutely necessary, you can probably count on a hand, and you probably have some fingers left over. Maybe your father was absolutely necessary. Maybe you had a teacher who was absolutely necessary. In your workplace, who there is absolutely necessary? And if nobody is that person, can you be that person who is absolutely necessary? And when I talk about Washington and indispensable, I think about something that Joseph Ellis mentioned in this podcast that John was just talking about. He was talking about the Battle of Long Island. And Joseph Ellis had been discussing the Battle of Long Island with a group of historians. And as probably everyone here knows, the Battle of Long Island did not go well. And Washington and his men basically escaped because the Howe brothers made a lethargic attempt to capture them, and there's a lot of discussion about why they did that and so forth, but they were able to get out. And these historians were positing a couple different questions. Question number one, what would have happened if the Howe brothers had gotten it together and captured the entire army? And most historians said, well, Washington would have created another army. That wouldn't have been the end of the war. Even if he had captured that whole army, they would have gone out and they would have started getting new people for a new army. And then Joseph Ellis would said, what if instead of capturing the army, they captured George Washington and they hung him? And most historians said, we would have lost the war. And so that goes counter to everything we learn about history these days. History is not about the great man or the great woman. It's about forces, it's about ideologies, it's about change in a seismic level. But every now and then you do have that one person who does change, sometimes his whole country, sometimes his or her whole world. And they're the people we get really excited about, aren't they? And so when I started this company, George Washington was somebody I really wanted to emphasize at the start. And the reason is this: he is the only one of the founders without a secret power. And I say secret power, without a superpower. And what I mean by that is, it's hard to learn from Franklin because he's too darn smart. I mean, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, these people have intellects beyond most of our capabilities. But George Washington is more of a regular guy who has more of a kind of mind that most of us can approach. So when you're looking at the story of George Washington and the success of George Washington, you're looking at somebody, and this goes counter to what Hawthorne and others believe, you're looking at somebody who had to fight to get his way into his leadership positions, and he had to go and he had to face a lot of challenges. Indispensable. Why do you say he's indispensable? Well, he's unanimously chosen to lead the colonial army. He's unanimously chosen to lead the Constitutional Convention. And he's unanimously elected President of the United States twice. So a lot of us here are fans of George Washington. A lot of us are interested in George Washington. But what we're here to do tonight, and what we're going to do on these 12 sessions, is we're going to talk about George Washington, not just to talk about George Washington and what a great guy he was, but we're going to talk about George Washington to take the lessons that he has left behind. And what I said in my book is, if success leaves clues, George Washington left a roadmap. And I found myself being able to give advice to my son, to other people, and going to George Washington. And I'll talk a little bit about how we got to this. But here's this other crazy thing about George Washington. We all know this too, that Light Horse Harry Lee upon his death says what? He's first in war, he's first in peace, he's first in the hearts of his countrymen, okay? So again, think about that. Very few people in the history of the world have ever been first in war and first in peace. You know, we all know The Godfather. Sonny was good at war, he wasn't good at peace, right? And then you had the reverse of that. Tom, right? I never thought you were a bad consigliere, Tom. He just wasn't a war consigliere. Here's George Washington, who became the primary leader in the war and then in the peace. And again, you look at history, that doesn't happen. So he's first in war, he's first in peace, and then he's first in our hearts. So what does that make people think? And in general, what they think is, what a jerk. Who wants to know about this guy, right? This guy's Peter Perfect. He was probably born fully clothed. He's born and he made a stately bow, and this is how he's always been. And who wants to learn about that? And then, of course, we got all these biographies that were written, first by John Marshall, then by others, that created this distance between us and this guy named George Washington. This human being named George Washington, this person who had all these challenges. We don't really hear about that in the John Marshall biography, because John Marshall's biography was done with a real intent. It's written in a time of political upheaval. You've got the Jeffersonians arguing against the Federalists, and so he wanted to really put George Washington on a pedestal, but by doing that, he and others really harmed George Washington because we lost that human connection. And every good teacher connects you to history. They don't separate you from history. The reason Lin-Manuel is such a success with Hamilton is not just that the music is good, it's that he showed people these guys are like us. And this is how we're connected to these guys. That's when history is good. That's when history is exciting. And when I know I've given a good tour, it's when someone says, I would have loved history if it had been taught like this. Or I never knew history was like this. And what I've always tried to do is learn from what Joseph Ellis, the way he writes his books, and we at Bowtie Tours, we try to replicate that as best as we can. So you can look at George Washington and say, oh, he's Peter Perfect, he's born fully clothed. But what you do in your life is going to depend on how you look at people who are successful. And what you learn as you get older is that people who are successful don't just luck into that, but they find a way to do that. And we're going to talk about how George Washington did that, okay? A lot of it is how he looked at things. And you know, we're in Philadelphia, okay? We know how to kvetch like nobody else on the planet, right? Every time we lose a game, we didn't just lose the game, God hates us. And it's a conspiracy. And why? One of my favorite moments was in the 2017 season, which I'm sure most of us here remember, when Carson Wentz got injured. And this guy called up WIP. and he starts weeping on the radio. And Angelo says, Angelo Guitar, yeah, he's crying. What's the matter? He's crying. And the guy starts weeping, and he goes, why does this always happen to us? And then every other football city in America played the tape and laughed at us. But that is the question we often ask ourselves. Why does this always happen to us? Why does this always happen to me? Right? And the thing is, it's the worst question your mind can ask you, because there is no good question to this, a good answer to this question. You know, why do I always fail when I stick to a diet, when I try to do a diet? Why do I fail? Well, there's no good answer, right? Because you're a pig, because you're a loser, because it's genetics and there's nothing you can do with it. You're absolutely asking a question that cannot result in a good answer. And of course, the thing about human beings is we really think, even if we know the world doesn't revolve around us, we kind of think it does, right? I mean, I was a lawyer, and there's no lawyer in the history of law who isn't convinced that every time they won a trial, it was his closing argument. It was never the evidence, it was never the witness. I closed and we won, you know? And you see that in the medical realities back in colonial times. You see Dr. Benjamin Rush coming up with the cure to the disease, to yellow fever, which was poison yourself so you vomit and you have diarrhea and then bleed yourself. And he did that and he got better. So he said, well, see, it cured me. And so everybody was doing that, And it was fascinating when COVID hit, I did a podcast about yellow fever. And it was so fascinating that nothing had changed in terms of people. I mean, the day I'm doing it, I look at a Facebook thing and somebody said, well, there's this pill my uncle took and then he got better, but of course the government won't let us take the pill. And then 50 people agreed, yeah, why can't we have the pill? Of course, some unknown person's uncle took it on Facebook and didn't die. Why aren't we taking the pill? Well, first of all, when we look at an event, we don't necessarily judge it correctly. And second of all, it's not really happening to us. It's not all about that. But of course, the irony here is we now know we would never have won that Super Bowl if he hadn't gotten injured in the Rams game, right? So we don't really know what events are and whether they're good or bad. Doug Peterson goes in the next day and he says, one player can make a difference, but it takes a team to make a miracle. And so that's leadership. People say Doug Peterson may not be great on X's and O's or whatever, but he kept that team together by showing everybody what they all had in common to work on. And, saying that this thing isn't over, that there's still something we can do. When we're at the end of this, one of the last months, we do a whole discussion on Washington crossing the Delaware, and it's one of my favorite things when we take all of this together. And we show how George Washington uses these ideas and how he uses psychology. And what's so exciting about this is I was studying that in order to give tours, and I started really looking and teaching people with it and telling my son how to live life with it. But part of it is simply moving forward and not assuming that the world has it out for you. Of course, if the world has it out for you, you don't have to blame yourself, do you? Because it isn't your fault that something happened. And once you start to look in the world and see it as people who are successful in general have done something we can learn from, instead of this is somebody we need to hate, or that this is somebody who was born fully clothed, that's when we start learning how to take these people's lessons and learn from them. My favorite scene in the movie of Rocky is in the first movie when Rocky's in that bar and he sees Apollo Creed up on the television set, and this is the first movie. Rocky's a known name. Nobody knows who this guy is. And the bartender says, and he calls Apollo Creed a clown. And Rocky says, clown? This guy's heavyweight champion of the world. He took a shot. What shot did you ever take? Right? And the bartender, being a Philly bartender, goes, you want me to take a shot, Rock? I'll take a shot. Right? He takes a shot. But that's Rocky understanding, even at his worst state, that, this guy, he's done something to get where he's at. It's the Teddy Roosevelt quote. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. So, here we're going to talk about George Washington. And to those who think, well, people like George Washington get the luck, so that takes up all the luck, and we don't have the luck. I'm here to tell you George Washington actually was born naked and alone. And George Washington actually had to deal with a number of things. Now, before we go forward and talk about the lessons left behind by George Washington to succeed and lead, I have to warn people, and when I do, schools especially, I have to warn these people. The bad news is this stuff is hard, and you have to have patience. And that's why looking at the examples of how people have actually achieved, to me, is so exciting in terms of looking at the historical examples. Next, or in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about all the mistakes George Washington made. And I love to do that with young people. When I can, I take them to Fort Necessity. It's a great place. Anybody here been to Fort Necessity? It's about 45 minutes out of Pittsburgh. And the greatest thing about it, it is absolutely the worst fort ever created in the history of forts. Because George Washington decides, let me build this little circle around all these wooded hills. So of course, that's the opposite of what you want a fort to be, right? You want to be up high and see far. He was down low, and the French could, of course, surround him. There's one good thing that came from this fort, though. It was so bad, it made the French nervous. They thought it had to be a setup. They said, there's got to be British behind. Nobody builds a fort on the bottom of a hill. And so they let him sign a document and get out of there. So it worked out for him. M. Scott Peck has this great quote in The Road Less Traveled. He writes, most do not fully see the truth that life is difficult. Instead, they moan more or less incessantly, noisily or subtly, about the enormity of their problems, their burdens, and their difficulties, as if life were generally easy, as if life should be easy. And he said, once we truly know that life is difficult, once we truly understand and accept it, then life is no longer difficult, because once it has been accepted, the fact that life is difficult no longer matters. And it's interesting, because when I made the transition between being a lawyer and being what I call a historical expeditionary, is what I now do. And I'm going to talk to you about that. But one of the interesting things was I drove Uber in order to make that change happen. So for about a year, I drove Uber. And the funny thing is that as a driver, with people honk at me, I would yell back, all the rest of that. When I'm an Uber driver, I didn't get bothered, because it's my job. People are supposed to be miserable, right? So, I would put the flashers on and wait for the person to come downstairs, and 5 cars would honk at me, and it didn't bother me. Once I accepted that as part of my job, it became different. And I had a conversation with my son. He was talking about, this is hard, that is hard. And I said, well, what if you looked at life like a video game? You want the game to get more difficult. You get annoyed if it isn't. And you don't get bothered when your game gets more difficult. That's exactly what you want. That's the fun of the game. Well, what if you looked at life like that? And I don't have a lot of leave it to Beaver moments with my son, but that was as close as I got. He said, you know, I never thought about it like that, and I left it alone. That's as good as that's going to get, you know. But, you know, it's true. Life is difficult. You know, Buddhists tell you life is difficult because it's the process of losing everything you love, including ultimately yourself. Henry James said it best. He said, life is a long, slow march into enemy territory. But it's also a dance. And we shouldn't forget that everybody in this room wins the lottery by being born. You know, the fact that you were born is insane when you listen to the facts, and it's 1 out of 400 million. I mean, it's almost the same odds of the Eagles winning on Sunday, you know. It's almost impossible. And, but it happens, right? We get born. Now, I'm convinced, and I look at people like George Washington, and I don't know if George Washington and those people solidified this belief or they gave me this belief, I'm not sure. But I'm convinced that when you are born, the key to success is finding your calling. It's what George Washington did. It's what a lot of people who have succeeded, just about every one of them does. In other words, it comes as a shock to many of us that life is not supposed to be miserable. That we don't have, I mean, look at the country we live in where we have a restaurant called Thank God It's Friday, you know? And we talk about hump day. And when I come to high schools, I talk to these kids and I say, well, who here hates Monday? And of course, everyone raises their hand. And I say, who loves Friday? And everyone raises their hand. And what I tell these group of high school kids is, that's perfectly reasonable because you have no control over your life, really. And, you know, you don't want to be up and doing geometry at 8 in the morning, maybe, and you know, so yeah, you don't like it. But I say, what's sad is that for most of you, if you live the life that statistically people live, in 10 years you're going to hate Monday, and in 20 years you're going to hate Monday, and that's pathetic. Because people do have the option of getting out of that and of living a life where they're involved with their calling. Now, how did I come to write this book about George Washington? How did I come to start this? Well, I was a lawyer. I was a lawyer for 25 years. And probably I loved it for about 10 years. Probably I was not crazy about it for 5 years. And then for 10 years I was miserable. Hated Monday, loved Friday, all the rest of it. And so why didn't I do everything? Well, it seemed like being an adult to me. It seemed normal. Everyone else was miserable. I mean, nobody's happy in the criminal courts of Philadelphia, right? The judge isn't happy to be there. The police aren't happy to be there. The witnesses and the defendant isn't happy to be here. So everybody complains about it. Everybody talks about it. You know, if they talk about anything, it's their vacation or their car, and everything else is how stupid their clients are, how evil the other side is, and that's kind of how life goes along. Well, I wrote a book about the presidential libraries while I was still a lawyer. And I took a road trip. And I visited all 13 of the presidential libraries in one driving trip. And I interviewed the presidents of these libraries. And I interviewed writers. I got to meet Robert Caro, who I'm a big fan of, who wrote the great books on Lyndon Johnson. I got to see his little office. If you've heard about him, he types, the reason he's been typing these since 1972 is he types them with a Selectric typewriter. If he had moved on to computer in 1980, we would probably have all the books now, but we're still waiting for the final one. So anyway, then I come back as a lawyer, and I just thought, you know, I went on a book tour And I thought, talking about history is just different from anything else I've done. Now, I think when you find your calling, you find a way to serve people, and you find a way where you feel like God is speaking through you, when you connect. And whatever religion you have, you just look around the world and you see that things connect with nature around them, or the things that do well, that it works with the plants, it works with everything. And so I wanted to do something where I talked about history. And so now it's one of these things where sometimes you get lucky. I watched this movie, and I'm a fan of Bob Dylan, and one quote I'm going to give you is, "Take what you can gather from coincidence." Take what you can gather from coincidence. Of course, Albert Einstein said coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. So I saw this movie called Chef, and Chef, it was about this guy who was a very famous chef, and he was doing well, but he was fighting with his boss, who was Dustin Hoffman, before Dustin Hoffman wasn't allowed to do movies anymore. And he ends up getting kicked out of this famous restaurant, and he just decides to open a truck and sell Cuban sandwiches. And so the idea was, here's the elemental thing you love. This is what you love to do, serve food. So forget about all the stuff around that you've been doing. Find a way to serve food. That's what you do. You've forgotten that. That's what you love to do. And so he had to clean out this truck, and he drove this truck, and I would watch this, and the thing that got to me was, wow, part of it was how he was tired at the end of the day. And I realized that for 20 years, my job had been sitting in a chair, and yes, I had the tiredness of existential angst at the end, but when you're picking, I was like, wow, look at him. He's sitting on his bus. He's tired. Everything that happened yesterday is done, and now he's just worried about tomorrow, and he's doing what he loves. And that kind of got into me. And somehow the idea came to give tours. Didn't know anything about it. But I thought, well, if I give tours, I can talk to people about history. It was as simple as that, because part of me was, I can go to graduate school. I'll only be 73 when I get out. But I just started doing tours, and I started doing them through Groupon, which means that I got like 33 cents for every tour, right? I got $5 a tour, but I did this thing, and I started pushing that company. That company's done really well. As a matter of fact, yesterday it just won an award, 4th year in a row, best tour company in Philadelphia. I just got the notification yesterday. But this is the interesting thing that happened. I'm studying all about the founders, and I thought, I used to be in the complaint club. I used to be around all these people complaining, and now I'm around all these other people. I was around George Washington, and I was around Jefferson. And I just looked at the way they lived and looked at their level of optimism. When we move on in a couple weeks, another thing I've learned from Washington is that there's 2 states of mind that you have in life. And everything you accomplish is when you're in the positive state of mind. I again, using a Dylan quote, you either got faith or you got non-belief, and there ain't no neutral ground. You either got faith or you got non-belief, and there ain't no neutral ground. And when I thought about that, I thought the interesting thing about that is there ain't no neutral ground. Because most of us try to do things in the neutral ground. We say we believe, but we don't really believe. So we're trying to be agnostic. Well, the brain doesn't understand agnostic. What does agnostic mean? Well, if you prove it to me, I'll believe it. Well, that's true of everything, right? If you prove to me that rabbits are smarter than humans, I'll believe it. But when George Washington is going to cross that Delaware, he realizes you have to have a state of total faith to do something like this. And you have to create that state. And I found this in a lot of the founders. When I read their letters, I'm amazed. Because during the war, they never seem to doubt that they're going to win. They're not like me, worried about Tom Brady. They're like, we'll win. You know, this is a setback, but we'll win. I mean, they just had the faith. And what John Adams, of course, says, he said, well, the revolution happened in 1775 before a shot was fired. The revolution was a change of mindset. As soon as we decided we were free, we were free. And really, what could they do about that? You know, as we saw, we always look at this war from the American perspective, but look at it from the British perspective. How do you win? They're not trying to crush us like the Civil War. They think most of the people are on their side. So you can't win once this mental decision has been made that no, there's nothing you can do to make us British citizens again. And you look back and you're just amazed because they keep sending out peace commissioners. And of course, we're all like, why would, but if you're alive at the time, aren't you thinking, well, maybe shouldn't we talk to them? I mean, the British are right there on the ocean, and they look pretty angry, and they've hired a lot of Hessians, and they look pretty mean. And maybe we could just cut a deal and get out of this thing. And they literally, if you read all their letters, they're not even thinking about that. Franklin's not thinking, well, maybe we'll cut this deal. John Adams isn't thinking that. They're like, no, we made the decision. You know, when you have full faith, you're saved from all that anguish. You don't have to worry about it because you've made that decision, and now it's just carrying it out. So that's something that we can all do. If we make the decision to create a business, it's just a matter of carrying it out. So when I say people do things and they're agnostic, you know, if you quit something 8 months into it, then you couldn't really have had full belief. I mean, this took 8 years to win this war. You know, I love it when people come up to me after seminars and they say, well, you know, I believe everything you say, I'm totally for it, but I've got a toxic partner. My partner's toxic. And what that means is the partner doesn't agree that this is a good plan. The partner is probably getting up and working so that you have health care. And, you know, and they're like, but everybody else agrees with my plan, right? So like you come up with this plan, I'm gonna make helicopters where the propeller's on the bottom. And you tell your neighbor, you know what, I got this dream. I want to make helicopters with the propeller on the bottom. And the neighbor says, oh, that's great, man. Go for it. And then you go to somebody, oh, it's great that you're following your dream. And then you tell your spouse, I want to do a helicopter. And your spouse is like, you're a pharmacist. What are you talking about? But the point is, if you believe, then your spouse not believing is just another thing that's going to urge you to move forward and continue and win. You know, I get all my lessons from the history books. And recently I read this book, I read Barack Obama's memoir. And he talks about when he wanted to run for Senate. You want to talk about a toxic spouse. Barack Obama's wife was not happy about this. She was done with politics. She was tired of being in debt. She was tired of Barack having to go out to Springfield. So he had just lost a race against Bobby Rush, and now he's like, well, I want to run for Senate now against this multimillionaire who nobody had any idea how he could possibly win. So he's like, but she's not hearing it. So Barack, he sets up a dinner with two neighbors because he's scared of her. Because if he says it to her face, she will hit him with something very nearby. So she knows what's going on here. So she calls the neighbors and she says, listen, Barack's got this stupid idea about running for Senate. We're going to cut this thing down right now together, right? And the woman, oh, yeah, I'm with you. So they go to the dinner. And Barack does his thing about running for Senate. Well, you know Barack, he can be pretty persuasive, and he can be charming. And the neighbors are like, you know, you really should run for Senate. So she's not happy about it. And she says, listen, fine, run for Senate. Spend all the money. I'm not doing anything to do with it. And I'm not making a speech for you, and I'm not voting for you. And so Barack was like, okay, great. You know, he was happy because he got her permission. And then he's like, well, she'll believe in me when I win, all right? That's the way a winner looks at it, though it's the way somebody with full faith in their decision. And she said, well, what are you going to do? How are you going to pay off all this money we owe? He says, well, I'll win, of course. Now, at the time, nobody thought he could win this race. I'll win the race, and, you know, then I'll be the only African-American senator, so then I'll get that book I wrote before that didn't sell, and I'll sell it, and it'll sell all over the world, and, you know, I'll pay off all my debts. And she's like, look at you walking around like you got magic beans. Well, a couple years later, she looks at him, she goes, everything you said happened. And he said, magic beans, baby. So, you know, you want to get to that point of the magic beans, baby, but what gave him the ability was his full faith in doing it. George Washington's calling. What is a calling? It's a purpose with a divine touch. You know, I used to love the old baseball books I used to read as a kid because they were all about a calling, right? You know, you'd have someone like Joe DiMaggio, and his parents think he can't, you know, his parents want him to fish like they do, and he goes, oh, I want to hit the ball with the bat. And they go, what is this, hitting a ball with a bat? This is ridiculous, you're wasting your time, you need to fish. And then one day, the kid comes and he goes, I've got a check for $50. And the father's like, oh my, did you rob a bank? Never seen this much money. No, it's to play in the minor leagues. And they say, well, this is a great country. And then you get rich and you hit the ball and you buy the house, right? What did George Washington want to do? His whole life, he wants to be the man, right? He wants to be important. He wants to be the leader. He wants to be the top of his neighborhood. He wants to have land. He wants all of that. He's born wanting that. His ancestors wanted that. They came to America for that. We're going to buy land. We're going to have land. We're going to reach success. And George Washington, as a very young boy, that's what he wants. Well, how is he going to do that? Well, his older brother, stepbrother, he's sent to England. He's going to learn things in England. He's going to go to college in England. He's going to get a gentleman's education. He's then going to be put into the military out in England. He comes back. You know, that's what George Washington's belief is going to happen with him. So George Washington, he wants this plantation. He wants this land. Let me tell you a poem he copied out. We're not sure. He probably did not write this, but it's a really telling story. This is George Washington as a young boy. He writes, these are the things which once possessed will make a life that's truly blessed. A good estate on healthy soil, not got by vice, nor yet by toil. Round a warm fire, a pleasant joke, with chimney ever free from smoke. A strength entire, a sparkling bowl, a quiet wife, a quiet soul. A mind as well as body whole. Prudent simplicity, constant friends, a diet which no art commends. A merry night without much drinking, a happy thought without much thinking. Each night by quiet sleep made short, a will to do but what thou art. Possessed of these all else defy, and neither wish nor fear to die. Now this is a fascinating little piece of doggerel that Washington has written down, because that really does describe George Washington. You know, the thing about finding your calling is that everybody has a different calling. And what some people want, other people want. Now, Thomas Jefferson would never write like this poem. Thomas Jefferson doesn't want a pleasant thought without much thinking. He wants to philosophize. He wants to study. George Washington doesn't want to do that. He wants things to be pleasant. Part of that is he grows up with a mother that makes things not very pleasant and very dramatic. He wants the fire. The fire is there and the smoke doesn't come in and he's in control. And he's got a quiet wife who's a quiet soul. This is what he envisions as a child. This is what he wants to have. And he runs into a problem. You know, he's got the plan as a little kid. Okay, I'm going to do what my brothers did. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to become a gentleman, and blah, 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 blah. Well, his father dies when he's 11 years old. And that ends all of that. He can't go to college. He can't go to college in England. He can't go to college anywhere. They don't have the money. He's not a gentleman. That idea for somebody that did not have full faith in that idea, on the completion of that idea would be crushed. But George Washington is determined to be a gentleman. Of course, a gentleman doesn't have to work for their money. George Washington is basically trapped in his house with his mother. People write all sorts of different things about Mary Washington. And I think we can understand her position, which is that, you know, Mary is the second wife of George Washington's father, first of all. So that means when George Washington's father dies, George is not going to get the sort of benefits that you would get if you're the oldest son, or if your mother is the only wife. All right, his two stepbrothers are going to get all of the inheritances pretty much. They're going to get those things. And he's stuck with this woman who wants him to stick around and do piddly jobs and do what it takes to bring money in. Now again, some people can really write nasty things about Mary Washington. So you're always entering into emotional territory where you start writing about mothers, you know? I think some people are writing about their mother when they write about Mary Washington. But there's no question that she's difficult. She's a very difficult person. At one point, Washington almost gets himself onto a British Navy. And he's even packed, and at the last minute, George Washington's mother says, no, I want him here, you know, bringing in money, doing some things here. So who knows how our lives would be different had she agreed to it. You know, there's this great story, and we're going to talk about the 7 Years' War in a couple weeks, but there's this great story where George Washington's trying to get this position with the British Army, and the general comes out to speak to him, and he sends a letter that says, and he's probably about, what, 20, 22, he says, my mother won't let me come talk to you today. And so the British general clearly said, this is why we don't want Virginians as our generals. But he's really trapped. How's he going to become a gentleman when he's living in this house and his mother basically wants him making money and doing what he can for as long as he can? Well, again, you take what you can gather from coincidence. There is always a way. And one thing that George Washington, one coincidence, is that about the only thing his father left for him was his surveying tools. He found the surveying tools. And so George Washington thought, well, wow, you know, if I can learn to be a surveyor, I get to leave the house, first of all, and get away from my mother. And she'll let me if I can bring back money. And I'll get to look at land. I love land. I'll meet people who own land. You know, he's going to take this thing and he's going to get everything he can get from it that's going to help him get his goal, which is to become this gentleman. And what else does he do? Well, he meets the Fairfaxes. You know, the Fairfax family, his brother marries into the Fairfax family. They're the most powerful Virginia family in the area. And so that has all sorts of impact on him. Of course, we all know he's very smitten with Sally Fairfax. But what it does is it shows him what gentlemen are. Now, kind of the lord of the Fairfax family, George Fairfax is about George's age, and George likes him, but one gets the idea from reading about him that he's kind of simpering. He's one of these people who's got rich parents and never had to do much. But his father is the guy George is fascinated with, because his father likes to go out there and rough it. And he likes to hang out with Native Americans. And he likes to sleep in his clothes 3 days in a row. The family thinks he's crazy. So he's looking at all of this and he's taking all this in. Because he's this big, tall guy who wants to do things physically, wants to do things energetically, and he's seeing what gentlemen are. He's getting what he can from the Fairfax family, because they're going to talk to people. They're going to tell other people about this guy. But he's also looking at, well, look, here's this one character who is still living adventures, despite the fact that he's a gentleman. You know what? Maybe you can do both of those things. You don't have to be this stuffy person who doesn't have any life experience. When people ask me if I'm glad I was ever a lawyer, I always think about, I went to this conference once and I saw this guy talking about Gettysburg, and I just came to the realization, this guy has never done anything. You know, he's been in school his whole life. And I thought, thank God, you know, I was a lawyer, because it made me who I am. You know, that's the other thing, is you're never wasting time. You know, because I had so many experiences dealing with all sorts of people, you know. And I saw this guy and I thought, wow, I'm so glad I had those experiences, because it makes me understand history. It makes me understand these people. And so George Washington, he's going to realize that there's other things you can do. And George Washington is going to use the things he has. Okay, first of all, what does he have? Well, he's a big, tall, strong guy. That's going to come in useful. Secondly, what does he have? Well, he knows gentlemen. So he knows how to act like a gentleman. Third, he knows how to survey. He knows land. And so what's going to happen down the road is he's going to get his opportunity. Now, his plan still is, I'm going to be in the British Army. That's the way I'm going to make it. I'm going to be in the British Army like my brother was. I'm going to come back, and then I'll join the House of Burgesses and so forth and so on. And so he struggles and struggles and struggles to do that. And we're going to talk about some of that in a few weeks. But he totally fails. But the important thing there is to be able to, when you've got a goal in mind, you have to be able to change in terms of circumstances. Like if you want to be a reporter and you're positive you're going to go to the Columbus School of Journalism, you've believed in it since you were in the 3rd grade, and then you don't get it into the Columbus School of Journalism, well, that's not your goal. That's just a means towards your goal. And so George Washington, it's not going to come to him the way he plans for it to come to him. And what's going to happen, though, is when they find out there are these French people out in what we called the West back then, anything past the Allegheny Mountains, the West out towards what we now call Pittsburgh, well, we wanted somebody to go out there immediately. Well, George Washington was strong. He could do that. He was a surveyor. He knew how to do that. So when you're looking at this as a historian, you're like, well, why are you sending this 21-year-old out? This is going to be a world war. Well, because he was there. He was available, and he was impressive. So we went out there. And we'll talk about that when we come back. In a few weeks, we're going to talk about that. But spoiler alert, he's going to make a hash of everything when he's 21, 22. He's going to mess everything up. And it's real simple if you look at him as a leader then as a leader later. You know, one of the things that makes George Washington so different from so many people is he does change pretty significantly. And I know he learned from the mistakes he made. He never called anything he did a mistake. But I know he learned because everything that didn't serve him well, he changed. And he's just literally not the same person when John Adams stands up to nominate him to be the general. And, you know, we always think when we start something new that we're an imposter, right? So George Washington is chosen to be the general of this army. Well, let's see. He's never won a battle. He's never really led an army. He led an army maybe half of the Battle of Monongahela. He hasn't been to college to learn how to fight, like everybody he's fighting against in England. He's never had any leadership position. I mean, can you imagine being George Washington and getting that job? Fighting against people who had all fought tons of battles? I mean, most of us, it would terrify us. But I think he looked at it, and everything you would say was a bad thing is also a good thing. That's something I used to teach people in the law. Every fact that's a bad fact, make it a good fact. Okay, he never went to college. Good. He didn't learn a bunch of things that isn't going to serve him, right? If you look at the Civil War, all these people went to the same college, and they're all fighting war based on what they learned, which was based on military situation that no longer existed. Everything had changed. The weapons had changed. Well, if you didn't go to college, you didn't get taught the wrong way to do things. And George Washington, Joseph Ellis, what I love about Joseph Ellis is he's very deep and he can go in depth about things, but also the guy can do sound bites like you cannot believe. They just come off of him. And I was talking to him about Washington, and he said, John Adams went to Harvard, Thomas Jefferson went to William and Mary, George Washington went to war. When they're off doing that, George Washington is getting kicked around, but he is learning invaluable things. He's meeting these generals in England. Some of them will be on his side, some of them will be on their side. He's seeing what works. He's seeing the Battle of Monongahela, and there's truth to the story that the British are standing up front and the French and the Native Americans are hiding behind trees, and George Washington sees this. You know what helps him more than anything else? He sees the British turn around and run. He knows the British can lose. So he learns all of that. What other things would he have to worry about? Well, he's not a good speaker. And he's a terrible speaker. He goes to the House of Burgesses, he never talks. When they nominated him to be the general, he stood up, he mumbled, he sat down, and then they kind of made a joke. Well, he's very embarrassed. He couldn't speak. That's one of those things that he looked at and said, well, I have to learn to do this. I can't be a general. I can't be a leader if I can't talk to people. And George Washington is going to make two just incredibly important speeches. One of them is after they cross the Delaware and they fight in Trenton, and he has to talk this army into returning. And he says, listen, you all have done more than anybody should ever be asked to do. And I'm going to ask you to do more. And then he did what all leaders do. He told them about their shared goals. He understood that he couldn't be like other generals. He had to talk these people into it constantly. There's no government. If they want to go home, there's really no way to stop them. He sees his army as if he's an entrepreneur, and he has to consistently talk them into staying with it. And he understands that, and that's a genius. You know, I say he has a mind that we're closer to, but in levels, he does have a genius. And having this intelligence and not being arrogant about that was very important. You know, the mistake people make is thinking getting a position of leadership is the most powerful part of leadership. And we talk about Washington leadership, you know, we talk about the 5 levels of leadership. The least important is having that position. But anyway, he's going to talk them into doing it, and then there's the time when he talks the army out of marching into Philadelphia. And he's able to, you know, he becomes a great speaker because he needs to be one. And that's what he has to do. So what we can get from this in terms of George Washington and finding your calling. Everybody has a calling. And so what we follow from George Washington is, number one, know what your calling is. That's the most important thing. That little poem he wrote out was really important because if you look at him later in life, that's what he wanted. You know, he wanted a wife like Martha. And I don't mean to act like she was milquetoast or she was a, you know, she was an incredibly competent partner in his marriage. But he wanted somebody quite the opposite of his mother. And he envisioned that. And he was able to attract that. He wanted to be the leader, the man, to the extent that, you know, what he accomplished was a phenomenon beyond anything we will see in our lives. We'll never see anybody unanimously elected to president, anybody that everybody agrees on. And he's able to do that without having an education. And he's able to do that surrounded by the most brilliant people that you can imagine. And that, believe me, that wore on him. That made him nervous. That made him scared at times that these people were so smart and he didn't feel like he had the same education. We're going to have an author come out here in a couple weeks and talk about Washington's reading habits. What Washington decided to read about was not philosophy like Jefferson and Madison and so forth, but let me learn how to build a sustaining farm, which may be why he's the only one of the Virginia founders who does not end up going bankrupt. So the key that Washington teaches us is, 1, figure out what your calling is. 2, take what you can gather from coincidence, move towards that calling. There's always things out there. There's always things like the movie Chef for me, you know, there's always books, there's always things where you could see people who have done this before you. And then, of course, it's always act. I mean, he took every opportunity he had, and he ran with it. I talk to so many people who are scared all the time. You cannot be scared of failure. And George Washington was never scared of failure. You know, he had no business being out there when he was 21 years old, talking to the French about that and doing what he was doing. But he had total confidence in himself. He had total faith. And he had a way of looking at things that he never considered any of those things a mistake or a disaster. They were just part of the road that he was taking. So I think if we follow that in terms of finding your calling, it's a great start for whatever you or the people in your family want to accomplish. Does anybody have any questions about any of this? I would love to answer any.